Well, we're starting. All right, we are live.
Cool.
Joining me today is a very special guest, Steve Fleming. Steve, for those who don't know you, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and psychologist based at the Wellcome Centre for Human Neuroimaging, which is at University College London. So we have we're a group of researchers looking at different aspects of the mind and brain function, and we all have a common interest in using brain imaging technologies like MRI and MEG. And my research group is particularly focused on studying metacognition and conscious awareness.
Very cool. You left out your most impressive qualification, which is former keyboardist for the William James Trio.
That's correct. Yeah, so I know Richard well through playing music together. And in fact, I was looking at our set list recently because it came up in my Dropbox somewhere. And I discovered the sheet music for How Insensitive, and I became really nostalgic about the William James Trio.
Yeah, I know. I was hoping that we could have a reunion at the last ASSC, but it didn't work out.
It didn't work out that time, no. I think Hackman was gunning for it, but yeah.
We'll leave that as a standing threat to anyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you do a lot of interesting work on metacognition. You also do a lot of like kind of popular writing on these issues, right? Because you write, I've seen stuff by you in like Aeon and various kind of, I guess, more generally accessible places. So do you think of yourself as kind of a science communicator as well, or is that kind of not how you think of yourself? Or
no, I think it's important to have that outlet. I mean, not everyone feels comfortable in doing that, and I can understand that like different people have different levels of interest in kind of science communication. For me, it's something that I do feel is important to kind of sometimes step back and consider the bigger picture. Like, why would people be interested in this stuff more generally? So I find actually doing that kind of writing really helpful in terms of like interacting with people who maybe don't think about this day to day. You know, when you write a scientific paper, then you know that there's going to be a handful of people in the world who are going to review it, and then maybe a slightly bigger handful who are going to read it. But you're kind of all in this bubble and you're just talking about this one issue, and it might become so important, like, you know, what are the properties of meta D prime, and everyone debates about this for like, you know, months and months and years. But, you know, no one picking up a copy of Scientific American is going to be necessarily that bothered about that particular issue, but they might be broadly interested in metacognition. So kind of doing that kind of writing, I think, is quite helpful in figuring out the bigger picture.
Yeah, and it's good. I mean, I think you're good at it too, and it's nice to have people that are doing the science still and also doing that, because I mean, sometimes I guess I have the perception that a lot of people doing that are not doing as much of the science anymore. They kind of step back from running the lab or actually designing experiments and are focusing on that sort of stuff more.
Yeah, and I think it's a balance, right? Because like, and I actually think it's getting better in terms of just the culture surrounding people doing a bit of science communication as part of the day job, really. Because I think a few years ago it was considered maybe not a great career move to do a lot of science communication on the side, because people would maybe perceive you as being less serious. And I don't think that's you know, a legitimate critique at all, really, in terms of like people often, as you say, people who are doing the science often can also, you know, write about it in their area of study.
Right.
And so I think there was just a bit of a reluctance to do it, and that's been dispelled, I think, recently by lots of, you know, senior, well-respected people who have put out popular science books, who have written articles for places like Aeon. So I think it's getting much more normalized, which is great.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it really is good to see that sort of stuff. Well, yeah, so I guess I'll ask about some of that other stuff later, but
sure.
So let me just sort of switch it to ask directly about metacognition. So one of the things that comes up a lot in thinking about metacognition is the different ways of thinking about it. So obviously, one way of thinking about it is thinking about thinking. Another way of thinking about it is as monitoring, and specifically with reference to notions of control, like which doesn't necessarily have to do with self-reflection. So I'm wondering exactly, when you say you're studying metacognition, do you distinguish between these sorts of things? And do you think of yourself as studying one versus the other? Or do you think they're really at bottom the same?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I mean, I think often in studies of metacognition in humans, there's almost like this kind of taken for granted assumption that we are studying something relatively explicit. We're asking people to reflect on how they're performing on different tasks. So I think often it's taken as read that the monitoring and the kind of self-reflective aspects go hand in hand. But when you move to the animal metacognition literature, these debates are really fierce. Like, people don't want to maybe ascribe the ability to self-reflect to non-human animals, but they're happy to say, well, they can monitor their performance, right? So I think that distinction comes up really strongly in that literature. But in the human literature, I think often people just think of them going hand in hand for the most part. But I mean, my views on this have kind of changed over the years, and I now do think that, like, there's good evidence that you can do quite sophisticated monitoring and control without any conscious awareness of that monitoring and control. So I think that kind of, with clever experiments, like things like looking at dissociations between things like error monitoring and your explicit awareness of whether you've made an error, when you can kind of start to dissociate those things out, then it seems like these are different qualities of the system. But often they do go hand in hand.
Experiment in mind, you're saying that kind of cashes this out?
Yeah, so there's a really nice experiment done by Logan and Crump, published in Science a few years ago, where they looked at skilled typists, and they had this clever setup where the typists were typing, they were audio typing, so they're hearing things over the headphones, and they were typing at speed. And what they could then do is, occasionally the typist would just make an error just naturally, and they would then ask the typist to kind of monitor whether they were making errors or not. But the clever manipulation was that sometimes if they made an error, they would actually correct it for them. So what appeared on the screen was the correct letter, because they knew what they were meant to be typing. Yeah, I know, right? But the really cool manipulation is that they would sometimes insert an error without the typist having made an error, right? So there's this like 2x2 dissociation where it's like, did you actually make an error? And what did you see on the screen, right? Was it an error or not? And what they found was that, like, implicit markers of error monitoring, things like slowing down on the next keystroke, were affected by the objective status, whether you made an error or not. Yeah. But your explicit reflective judgments of did I make an error or not were more influenced by what you saw on the screen, not your actual status of making an error. So that's a really clean dissociation between the monitoring process, which is going on, and the explicit kind of declarative I made an error or not level. So they kind of use that data to say there's like two loops of error monitoring. There's a more implicit one, and then there's this more explicit reflective one.
So the implicit one is the one that's governing the behavior of the slowing down.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
That's right.
And the more explicit one then is seeming to track, I guess, what their subjective experience would be, like whether they felt like they made an error.
That's right. That's right.
And do you think that this generalizes? Like, do you think this is specific to this kind of task, or do you think that this kind of because I know there's a kind of general, what we're discovering is there's a general kind of disassociation between the ability to do task and our ability to be aware of how good we're at doing the task. But this seems to be going a step further and saying that, in fact, we had to make a further distinction between different ways of being aware of how good we are at doing the task.
Yeah, I mean, I think what that kind of experiment shows is that it's possible to have some level of monitoring and then control without any conscious judgment of how we're doing on the task. And so I think there's just, this starts to pull apart kind of different levels of representation. So I think there's the dominant model in psychology in terms of the study of metacognition has been there's like lower level stuff, object level stuff, and then there's meta level stuff that's monitoring the object level. Right. And I think that what these kind of experiments are showing is that it's just not as simple as that like you could have kind of intermediate levels of monitoring that don't shade into full-blown reflective awareness of your performance. But I think that's a somewhat different question. That's almost like saying what signals are being used or to control behavior, which is a somewhat different question to saying can objective performance and metacognitive judgments dissociate.
Right.
So in a sense, it's like going beyond the standard paradigm, because like here, often when we're studying metacognition in the lab, we're not really looking at situations where people can adaptively control their behavior on trial by trial basis by using these kind of monitoring signals, right? We're looking at cases where we're just interested in this dissociation between explicit awareness and task performance, but there's probably, shades of gray in between those two.
Right. So do you think this is like an area for more research, obviously, but do you think this is a confound in some of the more general results that we're finding? If we're making too hard and fast of a dichotomy here?
It's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a confound. I guess it just suggests that things are more complicated than initially presumed. And I think also it puts a bit of pressure on the terminology we use. So I think there's, a pull towards simple dichotomies.
Right.
But it's clear that the brain is much more complicated than a dichotomy in terms of these levels of processing, and presumably, the way behavioral control is organized is also much more complicated than that. Now, there's an interesting, I guess this is where we shade more into consciousness, because there's an interesting thing there where people are still quite tempted by the idea that, there still is this dichotomy between implicit monitoring and control and more subjective judgments of our performance. But I think it just makes it clear that kind of the original two-level architecture is just not gonna be sufficient.
Yeah. So, well, I'm almost getting distracted by what you just said, but I guess what I was trying to, what the thought was that if we're looking for, especially at animals' behavior, and we're finding, well, okay, so here's some kind of control of behavior, which implies or suggests the kind of monitoring. And then we say, okay, well, they're doing metacognition. And in metacognition in humans is associated with self-reflection. And so here's control and self-reflection. But it seems like what you're suggesting is that that's obviously too quick, because there may be in between cases. And so that's the kind of question, that's the kind of thing I meant by a confound, was maybe that's
I see.
Some of the things that we're saying count as evidence of metacognition might in fact be something in between that, well, is a kind of metacognition, but something we'd want to distinguish from. I
see. Yeah, no, I think that I'd agree with that. And I think that, often when I talk to animal metacognition researchers, they're like, you guys studying humans, you have such an easy ride, because like no one in your journal articles are reviewing them and saying, is this really conscious metacognition? Right. So but I think it's a legitimate question in human studies as well. We stick a human in a psychophysics lab and we get them to do 600 trials of a boring task. And we think every single confidence judgment they're making is somehow this like, Cartesian reflective, I really get it right, which is clearly not the case. Right. Now, I think that, having done loads of these experiments myself, I think it is the case that, in general, you are kind of adopting a more reflective stance when you're doing the confidence rating. Right. Whereas things like just opting out of a decision might be tapping into a more implicit level. But I think, yeah, absolutely, these questions are not raised often enough in human and animal research, I think. on metacognition, because there's just there's a paucity of the labels we have available to kind of start studying these, start kind of discussing these intermediate cases. But also there's just a lack of paradigms, I guess, to like start dissociating them out. So often, you know, I always think it would be cool to try and study these things like together in one paradigm, like have a marker of performance, of implicit metacognition, and more explicit reflective judgments. And there have been a few paradigms that have done this, exactly like this typist study that I mentioned, but there's not enough of them out there.
Yeah, and that there should be more of that.
Yeah.
So when you were just a second ago, this is kind of tangential, but you mentioned talking about consciousness and saying that there seems to be a temptation for a dichotomy. Were you suggesting that maybe these kind of results might suggest we shouldn't be tempted towards the dichotomy with respect to or I wasn't exactly sure what that little tangential point you were trying to make there was.
Yeah, maybe it was just tangential. It's just too throwaway.
But I mean, are you someone who thinks that there's shades of consciousness or levels of consciousness? I know some people talk this way, but I'm not sure if you were one of them.
I think that I think that it is helpful to have to have terminology that allows us to discuss different types of consciousness. So I and you know more about this than I do, but like it feels to me as though when Ned Block was writing his famous papers on distinguishing different phenomenal access consciousness, monitoring consciousness, there was a sense in which, okay, we need to start, you might not agree with that distinction, but we at least need to start kind of adopting finer grained terminology. Right. And I just get the sense, I don't know, my perception of like recent ASSC meetings is maybe we're sliding back towards a more monolithic terminology. And we just now talk about consciousness. Now, we distinguish things like levels and states, levels and contents, right? But when we talk about conscious contents, there doesn't seem to be so much this discussion between dissociating different meanings of that word.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, because I think that's an important point. I mean, it seems when you talk about levels of consciousness, we can talk about, how vividly you experience the content, whether, and obviously we do this kind of stuff in the lab too, right? You say rate the visibility of this stimulus or something like that. And so visibility ratings or something like that might correspond to generally, how strongly experienced the stimulus was. But that's a difference in the kind of content you might think, the level of the content, not whether there's a vague kind of consciousness around. So I think it's hard to make sense of what it might mean to have vague consciousness as opposed to vague content. Now, of course, if we're talking about being alert and aware, so kind of, arousal levels, then there's a different kind of case to be made there. So, hypnagogic reverie or some in-between kind of state where you're kind of sort of semi-asleep but semi-awake, that's still a case whether you're either conscious or not conscious. So at least that's what it seems to me. So I'm not sure if you were suggesting that maybe we need some gray areas, or if you were agreeing with the point about the content being vague, but not the level of consciousness. Or
I guess I was thinking of it more along the lines of, it might be that it's useful to adopt a distinction between to kind of re-examine the terminology that we used to use in terms of things like distinguishing between an aspect of self-reflective consciousness versus aspects of maybe primary phenomenology that doesn't come along with self-reflection. I think sometimes these uses of the word consciousness get conflated. You can have two people who are just talking past each other because one person means kind of metacognitive awareness, and the other person means, well, no, I want to strip all that away. And I think this, we saw some of those debates at the recent ASSC conference. People like Rafi Malek saying, no, you want to strip away all the kind of higher order stuff, whereas people like Hakwan Lau were saying, that's what I think is the most interesting part to study when we're thinking about consciousness. And I guess, like, maybe you can reconcile those two and say, well, maybe one of the, maybe you're both right partly, but we can't just have one or the other. We need to kind of think about how both index different aspects of conscious experience.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds to me like what you're saying is partially that the way the science of consciousness has kind of unfolded is there's been a kind of fleeing from thinking about theoretical concepts, like distinguishing different notions of consciousness, and being somewhat more more in tune with some of the more philosophical questions, like what kind of thing are we talking about when we're talking about this kind of thing, consciousness, as opposed to that kind of thing, monitoring or something like that. And if you don't have that kind of debate, and obviously there's always kind of lip service to it, but a lot of times it seems to me that scientists sort of see that as a waste of their time to be cutting these distinctions and making all these fine distinctions. They want to get to the data. But of course, if you don't have the kind of theoretical stuff first, then the data is not really going to be all that meaningful to you.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think we want to at least agree on a kind of set framework for running the experiments in.
Right.
Otherwise, you just
you would agree that there isn't one right now. I mean, that's basically what you're saying. Yeah,
I think it's evolving, and we just shouldn't. I think it was really nice your discussion with Matthias Michel about the history of consciousness science. We need to keep in mind our history,
right?
To really not forget, useful distinctions that were perhaps made a few years ago that now get brushed under the carpet, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, part of that seems like something that the society like the ASSC could take a role in. I mean, one of the things we kind of would help would be like a canonical textbook or something like that, which there really isn't one for this kind of.
No. There you go. Maybe you've just you're offering to take on this role.
Yeah, to have you write it. Yeah, exactly.
You're offering to supervise me write it.
Yeah, exactly. No, it would help. It would help, though.
I agree.
But also, I mean, I wonder if this is something more general. But I wonder. Some people have kind of speculated that cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience is kind of dissipating in a sense, and you don't find departments being named cognitive neuroscience anymore as much as and a couple of famous ones have even changed their names recently, and it's been kind of absorbed into just the neuroscience and the psychology departments in a lot of these in a lot of places. But you still see cognitive science as a distinct thing from neuroscience and psychology that should have its own methodologies and so forth, or how do you view that relationship?
I mean, I think cognitive science draws on lots of different fields. So it takes elements of neuroscience, takes elements of AI and computer science, and elements of psychology. I think it's true that certainly the sharp distinction between, say, a neuroscience department and a psychology department have certainly become blurred with the advent of brain imaging and cognitive neuroscience. But I still think that there's a useful cognitive science / cognitive neuroscience. I think basically inherits a particular set of ways of thinking about information processing, kind of adopting more computational views of what the brain is doing and how that might support various mental functions. So I think that it's almost like you're adopting a particular set of shared assumptions when you're doing research within cognitive neuroscience. And usually that's a more kind of information processing model of how the brain is working.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And actually brings me this kind of your recent proposal about some of a computational model about what might be underlying metacognition, which I wanted to ask you about. This is your higher order state space model, which The
Yeah, so
Haas,
not underlying metacognition, because I actually think that's
oh,
quite
judgments of
different.
awareness. Sorry.
Awareness, yeah.
Right,
So I think going back, this kind of feeds into the discussion we were having before. So yeah, I think it's more. This is kind of one of my first forays into trying to do more on conscious awareness per se, rather than just thinking of it as something that kind of comes along with, or often comes along with metacognition. Yeah.
So, but so sorry about that. I misspoke. But this is the higher order state space model.
Yeah.
Do you call it Haas?
I guess this is one of the first times that I'm calling it Haas out loud. So yeah, okay. let's call it Haas. That sounds fun.
Okay, so can you tell us, a little bit about what the model is aiming to do, and then I want to talk about some of the predictions that it makes, which I think are pretty cool.
Sure. So I guess the first thing that I think is an important point to make is that my view on like the way in to starting building a model of awareness is very much by starting with the data we have, and that really are reports. We have as humans this ability to report about our experience. And I think, again, this is maybe a broader discussion about the history of consciousness science, but I think reports have also got a bit of a bad rap recently. They just seem so impoverished. It's not as if my conscious experience is just a yes, no binary thing, right? So, and this is also, I think, interestingly underpins these, fierce debates about overflow and so on. But I think, in a sense, we've been distracted by models such as signal detection theory into thinking that reports are just one big artifact that we need to get rid of when we're doing consciousness science. And I think that that's one. Signal detection theory I'm a big fan of, and I use it a lot. But I think this is one thing where signal detection theory has gotten it quite wrong. That actually reports do have this richness to them that our simple models have not yet captured, but I think they could capture in the future, right? So I think the starting point for the Haas model was the idea that we should start with reports and try and figure out the kind of computations that might support conscious reports about mental states.
So, and in particular, this is just like reports of I saw it, or it's there versus it's not there. So these are simple reports about visibility of stimuli and things of that.
That's right. Yeah. So one starting point is and this is what we can take from the empirical literature on awareness reports in simple tasks. One thing, as you just saying there, is that like these reports are actually surprisingly simple. They're very abstract, but they're pretty low. They're pretty simple in terms of they range often from, in perceptual experiments, you're dealing with reports about, am I aware of something or not? And that might be operationalized as, is the stimulus visible or not? And, that's distinct from other kind of judgments we can make about the stimulus, which are more judgments about things in the world rather than judgments about, my experience. Was I aware of that stimulus on that trial?
Right. So is it left or right or things of that nature?
Exactly. So I think the key, the kind of the starting point or the computational insight is that if we want a computational account of these kind of abstract awareness reports, we need to start thinking about what is known as factorized state spaces. So we can have two separate causes of the sensory data. So what it is, but also whether I've seen it. So becoming aware of, say, a red tilted thing on the computer screen might depend on me having this abstract state of things are generally there or not. That's not bound up with the state of things being red or tilted and so on. So that's the key. That's the kind of key idea of the model.
Right. So that the there's an argument in the paper that I wanted to ask you about, which I think is in the vicinity of what you're talking about, although I'm not exactly sure. But so some people might think that the kind of awareness judgments that you're trying to explain are judgments about things in the environment rather than things about one's perceptual model at a certain time, right? But you say there's two reasons why we should think of these kinds of judgments as really being based judgments about a perceptual model. So can you tell us what reasons do you think there are?
So I'm not sure what the question is. The reasons I think that these are judgments about awareness rather than
judgments about
the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think that it could turn out, and this is more of an empirical question, that the way we do judgments, the way that we detect things in the world also sometimes involves these higher order awareness states. But I think the key argument here is that when we are commenting on our experience, so when I am making a subjective judgment about whether I've seen something or not, then I'm, in a sense, making a decision about whether my perceptual model of the world has signal or noise in it, right? So, there might have been some kind of processing going on, but this second order introspective judgment says, well, I'm saying that wasn't really signal in the world. So that's the kind of idea that it's because these judgments are second order, or they're somehow getting at this level of awareness about perceptual content, then we need to bake that into the structure of the model.
Right. Yeah. No, but I guess that's what I'm asking about, is that first step. Not that I disagree with it. I'm just curious about what the reasoning is that you think leads from one to the other. Because someone might say, look, if you're asking, and I'm not saying I'm saying this, but someone might say, look, if you're asking people about whether they saw something or not, then you're asking them about whether basically the thing was there or not. So when they're giving you judgments, they're giving you judgments about the thing out there, not about their experience of the thing.
Yeah, true. But I think I would say back that the fact that we can do that for basically any types of perceptual content means that this is an abstract state that's factorized away from, being red or tilted or anything like that, right? So I can ask you, did you see a red thing? Did you see a blue thing? Did you, the kind of did you see or were you aware of it is abstract and, completely dissociated away from any particular types of content.
Right.
I think that,
Isn't that just the same as saying, was it there? So one way of phrasing it is like, did you see it? And that makes it sound like you're thinking about your own experience. But another way of saying is it there? And that makes it sound like what they're thinking about is like the stuff out there.
Yeah, no, I think I'd be willing to concede that point. I think I'd remain agnostic about whether, as I said before, it could be that these abstract states, because they are indexing part of they're indexing a feature of the world that is very general, that's not about any particular stimulus type or any particular property, and instead it's just whether things are there or not, right. in your perceptual input. So I think that sounds fine to me. I think where you might be able to start to tease those apart is by thinking about cases of reality monitoring, where people can kind of distinguish between perception and imagination. But that's slightly different, a different thing. But I think this model might also speak to those kind of ideas as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So, okay, let's put that aside. I guess I'll come back to that in a second. But because one of the things that I think is really cool about the model that you present is since the state space is asymmetric, in particular, that there's only one way to say that it's not there, but many ways to say that it is there, that you get a couple of nice results from that. So one is that you think maybe this is a computational correlate of explosion or kind of a widespread ignition, not explosion, but a widespread ignition in the brain. But also it makes some empirical predictions that we should find some differences in people's reports about not seeing the thing that we wouldn't expect from other models.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through what these predictions
no,
might be?
you've done it. No,
and we're done, folks.
yeah. No, so yeah, you're absolutely right. I think this is one of the reasons why I'm excited about this approach, because it's still a very kind of abstract model, in the sense it's not a model of how neurons fire and so on, but it could have the potential to make some coarser scale predictions that we could test with brain imaging experiments. And this is exactly what we're trying to get set up at the moment in the lab in London. So the one key idea is that so in a lot of early work looking at contrasting subliminal primes against primes that were seen by people like Stan DeHaan and colleagues, they showed these, when you say you saw something, you see this kind of global ignition response across the prefrontal and parietal cortex. And that was interpreted by them as evidence for their global workspace model, right? So that information is shared widely throughout the brain, and that's a correlate of conscious processing. So I think what's interesting about this approach is that you can potentially explain those kind of global ignition responses as, rather than reflecting information sharing across the brain, instead now we think of them as showing a large prediction error in cases where you say you saw something versus cases where you didn't. And the reason you might get that big prediction error is because there's just this asymmetry in the state space. There's just many more ways in which things can be seen than not seen. And so when you do say you've seen something, you're kind of resolving content at lots of different levels of the hierarchy on the kind of scene side. Whereas when you say you didn't see something, there's just really one thing that gets resolved, right? It's I didn't see anything, and that's the same, didn't see anything for everything. So that's the general idea, that the kind of global ignition responses reflect this asymmetry in the prediction error that you get on seen versus unseen trials.
So when you say it reflects the differences in the prediction error, and that basically is taken that there's all of this levels of content that are being updated as the
that's right, yeah,
as the state is deciding which report to issue, I guess. But it's not.
Yeah, so I guess I've kind of, maybe it's useful to just go back a step and kind of fill in what I mean by prediction error there. So yeah. So I think one important difference between the model that I'm proposing and a model like Global Workspace is that the model I'm proposing is situated within this broader class of models known as generative models or predictive models. So in cognitive science, you kind of have this broad distinction between models that are feed forward or bottom up. So they take an input, they transform it in a particular way, and then they spit out the answer. So my laptop's like that, and a lot of neural networks are like that. Kind of they process information in a bottom up way. But a generative model is quite different, right? So a generative model starts with specifying how the data are produced. So it has this top-down aspect to it. Right. And that means you can then, when you see some data, when you feed the model some data, it can then do what's called invert the model, so it goes from the data to the inferred causes. So these models now are really popular in in explaining various perceptual phenomena. So the idea is that in the Haas model, I'm kind of like bolting on a higher order state to standard predictive coding architectures. And this higher order state is like the highest state possible. It's just when it's on, it's just generates the possibility of seeing something rather than nothing. So it's like a kind of really high level switch that's not usually put in models of perception, because they just start with the assumption that the model is going to perceive something, right?
Right.
Whereas when you start to think about, well, what do you need to add to the model to get it to report, is it seeing anything at all? Then you get into this idea that you need to add in these higher order states. So that's what I mean by a generative model. And then prediction error is basically this idea that the model starts in some state, but then when you feed it input, it changes the state it's in, and it does so in different ways depending on the level of the model that you're looking at. And so how much it changes from that state it was in before it got the data to the state it was in after it got the data is known as prediction error. And there's lots of theories about how prediction errors in those kind of models are tightly linked to neural activation. So one of the most well worked out of these proposals is Carl Friston's predictive coding ideas. So that's the general idea. So you need this, when you have this asymmetry in the state space between seeing something and not, then when you say you see something, then there's lots of possible things it could have been. So that generates lots of changes in the system on that side of the graph.
And that's, you're suggesting possibly why we see this kind of ignition in all of these prefrontal areas and other areas as well, actually, because that's where all these levels are being updated. That's why the activity.
That's right. So that's the idea in terms of like the ignition at multiple levels of the system. But one important difference between kind of our model and the kind of ignition-like responses is that at the very highest level, at this in this higher order state, it's because it's so simple, there shouldn't actually be much difference between saying seen and not seen, or aware, because the prediction error at that higher order level is relatively symmetric. And so that's what we show in the simulations in the paper. So that then generates an interesting prediction that if you then go and actually study using brain imaging, and these kind of awareness reports, then you should be able to discover brain signatures of both the asymmetry, so this global ignition, but also the symmetry of the higher order state.
Right. So if you had to, I know that your model doesn't make any anatomical predictions or anything like that, but if you were looking at the prefrontal cortex and wondering where you might find this, so I know that we're finding that your work suggests, and a lot of work I think, but suggests that maybe the more dorsal areas of prefrontal cortex are involved in making judgments about past things we've seen in the past, whereas more medial areas are involved in predicting how we're going to do. So does your idea suggest that we would find the symmetry in a particular area because of the differences here?
I think, I would be I'd probably want to remain relatively agnostic about where we would see it. I think it's reasonable to say that kind of higher order association cortex, prefrontal parietal areas would be candidate regions, but that's obviously very broad areas of cortex. Mm-hmm. I think that there are a few data points out there that suggest that there are more symmetric responses in the dorsolateral and frontopolar cortex in studies of perception. So there's a couple of papers from Andreas Nieder's group looking at recordings in monkey dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and they see these symmetric responses for decisions about yes, things were seen, or no, things were not seen. And they seem relatively abstract in terms of you get the same symmetric response, regardless of whether it was a decision about a square or a triangle or a circle and so on. So that's one data point. But there's also, there's a couple of others out there that suggest that maybe the frontopolar cortex is engaged in creating particularly abstract representations. So to the extent to which you think the prefrontal cortex is generally involved in abstracting away from concrete aspects of the input, then you might expect that the most abstract representations are found in these kind of hierarchically higher areas of the prefrontal cortex. Right. So that's, I think it's difficult. Yeah. And we do have a couple of imaging data sets now that we're analyzing where hopefully fairly soon we're going to have some more solid answers on this.
That's very cool. And how, I mean, not to jump the gun on this, but how do you think you could differentiate between, I mean, so I assume you think there is global broadcasting. I guess I should ask that. Do you think that this model of that there is, so even if you're a fan of predictive coding, which I think, the only question in my mind is whether predictive coding is anything new or exciting, or whether it's just something we've already known about for a long time. That there are basically inferences at all these levels. Anyway, so that's the math of it is interesting and new, I think, but that's a different question. But do you think that there is global broadcasting? I think whether it's related to consciousness, but just that it occurs in the brain.
Sure. I think what predictive coding brings to the table is the emphasis on top-down connections. And we know from just kind of basic anatomy that there are many, many feedback connections in, say, the visual hierarchy. They're more numerous than the feed-forward connections.
Right.
So this kind of dominant model that I think was, a lot of the way a lot of us think about the brain intuitively is, this idea of taking an input and then feeding it through to different regions. That just anatomically can't be the whole story, because we know there's these massive feedback connections. So I think predictive coding provides a really strong framework for thinking about why those are there. But then if, clearly there is also widespread information sharing. We know that, a lot of higher cognition relies on what looks like relatively widespread broadcasts, things like working memory. It's very flexible, and you can get lots of different information content into these prefrontal circuits. So clearly there must be relatively widespread broadcast. I guess my reluctance in endorsing broadcast is this idea that it just seems quite feed forward. If you think about it instead in terms of these predictive models, then almost you get global broadcast for free, because the higher levels of the hierarchy have just a wider conceptual purview compared to the lower levels. So in a sense, you're going to get something that looks like broadcast in those kind of models, because the information gets aggregated as you go up the tree.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, the reason I was asking that is because I was wondering how you might differentiate experimentally between activity that is doing the broadcasting stuff and activity that is doing the in terms of the ignition, which is doing the prediction error memorization stuff. But it sounds like maybe what the difference is once I guess you'd have to look for time differences and whether the activity comes back or sort of re-entry.
I mean, it'd be interesting to actually, I don't know whether, if we were to ask Dan DeHaan and say, would you be happy with us saying that global broadcast is like a very high level prediction error? Maybe he'd go, yeah.
We'd be fine. Yeah, maybe that'd be fine.
And then we wouldn't need to have the debate, right? But then I think, but I think there is a deeper conceptual contrast between the kind of approach I was advocating in this paper and global workspace. And that is just that the idea here is that to be able to report our awareness about a stimulus, it's not just enough to have widespread processing of information related to that stimulus, right? Because it seems like that would allow the system to say there is stimulus X, but it wouldn't conceptually allow the system to say I am aware or I have seen stimulus X. Right? So the idea is that you need to have some kind of high level state that allows you to create to make that report, and that's what I don't think falls out naturally from global workspace approaches.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I think this is like related to a point that Hawkwan makes a lot, which is that, you know, you need to do some signal detection on the signal that is coming in from the lower order areas since there's, I mean, this is kind of a general conceptual point, since there's always spontaneous neural activity, then you need some kind of higher order monitoring mechanism that decides whether the activity is just spontaneously generated or driven by some external stimulus. And that's what you're trying to get at, is maybe a computational under a mechanism which would do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think Hak-Kwan Lau's recent paper on reality monitoring, and the earlier ideas that you need some kind of higher order signal detection, I think they're very aligned with this proposal, because at the core of those proposals is that you need some way of figuring out whether your perceptual system is just, whether there's just noise there or whether there's some kind of signal. So it's not enough just to kind of shuttle those signals forward. You need to have some higher level inference about whether, those lower level signals reflect things in the outside world or not.
Right. So so if you think that this is a psychologically real process, which, I mean, you could test and you're looking into, so if you think it is a psychologically real process, would you speculate that the content of these states is something like what Hawkwan suggests, that it's either the content is like this is veridical or this is noise or this is working memory, or do you have any thoughts about what at the psychological level, what those kinds of states might be?
I mean, I think at the moment in the current model doesn't really address the distinction that Hak-Kwan makes between imagination and perception, or working memory and perception. So I think that's a somewhat distinct issue. So I think my understanding of what Hak-Kwan is arguing is that the system evolved to be able to discriminate those two cases, and then after it's evolved that capacity, it then almost has the ability to distinguish signal from noise for free. It just, that's kind of a byproduct. Whereas I'm trying to get at more of the signal and noise issue. That's the starting point I have in this model. So in terms of like what psychologically it would mean to know, to kind of represent the difference between signal and noise, I mean, I think this is where it connects to ideas about reports and phenomenology. I think it does have this flavor of endorsing a particular endorsing perceptual content. So if the system is saying yes, there is generally signal in my perceptual generative model, then that to me seems like very closely connected to ideas about phenomenology. So I don't think there would necessarily be a kind of independent feeling of or sense of that higher level representation. Instead, I would view it more along the lines of higher order theories of consciousness, that like this higher order state is what constitutes phenomenology in concert with the lower order perceptual states.
Interesting. And so it's the in concert part. So, I mean, this is part of why I'm asking the question. Maybe this goes beyond what you care about. And you can always tell me, Steve, that I don't care about that. It's fine if you don't care. But part of what's interesting to me about this is a debate that's in the background between someone like Hak-Kwan and David Rosenthal, because part of some of the stuff that Rosenthal obviously is well known for his higher order thought theory of consciousness, and according to him, the kind of states that we're talking about are thoughts. So they have intentional contents. They're described like I am seeing red. It's just or I see red, or what I'm experiencing pain, or I'm in pain, or something like that. So just kind of normal thoughts. But arrived at automatically, and so forth and so on. And then Hak-Kwan argues, well, there's this mechanism, it has these states, it's vertical, it's noise or not. And then David says, oh, well, that's just, the same as my theory, because that's just a neurological implementation of these personal level psychological states. And so I'm wondering if, like, where you might fall on a debate like that, whether you think that it matters that the contents can be described in kind of folk psychological terms, whether we say that this is a thought that has content like I am seeing red, or whether you care about that, or if this isn't something that you think the model is going to ever address. So I'm just wondering what you're feeling about the relation to the computational stuff, to the folk psychological stuff.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting set of questions. I mean, I feel slightly out of my depth on responding to it, but I guess my one issue with thinking about this is I never really know what a thought would look like in conversational neural terms, right? Like, you can kind of start specifying these kind of models and think about, hierarchies and models of perceptual processing and stuff. But when you get to thoughts, you're like, well, okay, are we talking about things that can be couched in language? And then do we need a model of this? Do we need a model of like kind of symbolic information processing? It just becomes all quite vague and fuzzy to me in terms of that. So, I think in that sense, no, I don't think the model really says anything about the nature of those higher order representations. The one thing I think it does bring to the table is the idea that it's, because this kind of inference in these hierarchical models can be relatively, I guess, automatic is one way of thinking about it. I don't think there's any need to invoke a kind of more strategic or cognitive access to this information. So I can't remember where I read it, but I think maybe Peter Carruthers makes this point that, higher order theories, you can think of them as just having these occasional flickers of higher order inference.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you're kind of having this very heavy duty cognitive representation. As long as you get some kind of inference at these happening in these abstract states, then I would think that would be sufficient. So that might be useful for starting to think about, well, could a higher order approach be compatible with data on, say, overflow? So it could be that, like, yes, because in this kind of model, you might have this pretty sophisticated higher order machinery that's doing this inference, but it's doing it all the time. Like, it's doing it, regardless of whether I'm in an experiment where I'm asked to hold certain items in working memory, which might be a completely different type of problem that I'm solving. So I think that, this is complete speculation, but I would be tempted to say that, when we start writing down higher order models of consciousness in these kind of hierarchical models, computational models, then we might start discovering that actually, that kind of inference is quite distinct to a whole other branch of cognitive psychology, which is interested in things like working memory and decision making and so on.
Interesting. Okay. And that's, I don't want to put you out on a plank speculating too much, but it's interesting to hear these speculations. Because I wonder to what extent what you're talking about is how higher order of a theory of consciousness, what you're suggesting is. So you said that, so on the model that you have the kind of lower order stuff driving the higher order state, basically. And so what does the theory say, if anything, about cases where you don't have the first order activity or the lower order stuff, but you somehow accidentally arrive at the higher order state?
I mean, I think this is the nice thing about adopting generative models, is that you can easily have that. You can easily get that from changes in the priors. I can like simulate the model where I have a strong prior that things are going to be seen.
Right.
and then it can start telling me things are seen, right, in this really tiny architecture that we've got.
Right.
So I don't think there's any problem with that. I think maybe
the problem would be like so if that's what happens, then do you count it as having phenomenology? I mean, not in the toy model, maybe you don't want to say that, although I don't know if you do or not, but in our case,
Yeah, no, I don't want to say that.
Okay.
Not in a two-dimensional simulation model.
Well, hey, I don't know. There are
but this is an interesting question. Maybe we can come on to this, because this is an interesting question. And I was pushed on this by Ned Block at the end of my talk.
Right.
In SSC. So maybe we should come on to this, actually. But just to address the point about kind of self-generated or kind of illusory higher order states. So I think that, in terms of the way a generative model is set up, there is really no distinction between the products of inference that are generated by priors, kind of endogenously, and the products of inference that are generated by bona fide input, right? So in that sense, in this particular model, it couldn't tell these things apart. Right. But this is exactly where I think it connects to these interesting proposals about reality monitoring. And this is a debate that, I've been having with Hak-Quan Lau. I also saw that Sam Gershman wrote a paper on these issues recently, relating them to these generative adversarial networks. Yeah. So, and we had this conversation on Twitter between like me, Sam, and Hak-Quan and a few others, and I think it was revolving around this issue, saying, is reality monitoring enough to give you phenomenology, or give you an explanation of why certain things have phenomenology and not? Because even in the cases of top-down endogenously generated imagination, when those are strong enough, presumably those would also have phenomenology. So in a sense, it's like, yes, you could tell whether my phenomenology is internally generated or not, but it doesn't seem to tackle the issue of whether things are there or not in your perceptual experience. And so I think, I still haven't kind of thought this through properly in my own head, but it feels like if you can combine some elements of that proposal with some elements of the kind of models we're working with, where you can start addressing directly why the model concludes it is seeing something or not, or why the model concludes things are there or not, then you might be able to have the best of both worlds.
Right. What are the best of both worlds?
The best of both worlds would be a model in which you could have an explanation for why it says it's seeing something or not, but also, orthogonally to that, it has the ability to say the thing that it's seeing is in imagination or reality.
I see. Yeah. So not only can it distinguish whether something is there or not, but it can distinguish whether the thing that's there or not is internally generated.
That's right. That's right.
It sounds like, the question that I was asking about how higher order is a theory sounds like it's higher order enough. I mean, basically the idea is if the system can't tell the difference.
Oh, I was in suspense there.
Judgments, pass.
Yeah. I'd have to just call it. I'd have to just call it.
Yeah, exactly. No, I won't even. I'm not even going to touch that.
Exactly. To remove the word higher order. Yeah.
But I mean, if it's a higher order theory of consciousness, I think one of the key claims that we want to know about is whether, in the absence of the first order state, you still get conscious experience or not. And
right.
If it really is a higher order theory of consciousness, then the answer should tend to be yes, at least to some, whether it's the same or impoverished or whatever. I think that's an interesting question, but there should be some kind of experience, especially if you're going so far as to say is that the system can't tell the difference between a judgment generated by just the priors versus driven by the actual lower order content.
Yeah.
Then
and presumably there are plenty of cases where we can't tell the difference, because we know that the priors play a strong role in just regular perception. Right?
Yeah. I mean, to take a kind of limit case, I wonder, you had the nice thought experiment in your paper about a dark room versus with a person with their eyes closed versus with their eyes open. And so you have the same kind of level of neural activity, but the person with their eyes closed is sort of going to be certain that they didn't see anything. Whereas the person with their eyes open is going to be, well, they're not going to be certain because there's always going to be a possibility that maybe they, they're getting some of that weak activity is representing a signal as opposed to noise. And the only difference is whether the eyes are open or the eyes are closed.
Right, exactly. Although actually that example was almost introduced to explain why, the limitations of the model, that actually at the moment, the current proposal couldn't distinguish between those two things.
Well, but that was kind of the point that I was going to. That was the point that I was making. Actually, was that if in the eyes closed case, so if you have a case where you don't know which one it is, if you're told your eyes are, your eyelids are opening and closing randomly or something like that, or that there's a shutter screen in front of you opening, or so some of that noise you may interpret as a signal, and you may actually come to experience that you saw something, or at least that's what the model seems to predict.
Yep. No, absolutely.
So rather than a limitation of it, this is one of the themes that I've been trying to push a lot. And when I force people to think about this stuff is that, the kinds of stuff that Ned talks about, and a lot of people think is an objection to higher order theory, is actually an empirical prediction of the theory. It predicts that you should have these kind of conscious experiences when the first order stuff is missing or weak or degraded in various ways. And that's something that we can try and check, and see whether that ever happens.
But I guess, so I always get slightly confused about that argument, partly from thinking about it in view of these kind of generative neural models, because presumably you can say, okay, the first order state is missing, but as soon as I make a change to the higher order state, that will have consequences, right? So in a sense, like maybe the middle ground is really about whether things are endogenously generated, right? Not necessarily whether the first order state is kind of missing or different. It's like, is the system working in a mode where the perceptual experience is being generated more endogenously or more bottom up? Yeah,
I see what you're saying, because as soon as you make a change to the system, there's back propagation, and immediately it's influencing what's going on at the lower order levels.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's why in the cleanest kinds of cases, whether you could get something generated just by priors is really the best way of thinking about it, which is what you're saying basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. No, but it still, predicts that if you have an anatomical lesion or inactivity through some other reason and non-redundancy, if you can somehow nail all that down, which but if you don't have the visual system, you don't have a backup of the visual system, and yet you still have and yet you still have visual experience, then and if that's related to these kinds of higher order metacognitive areas, then that would be pretty good.
Yeah. No, I think that is I think I mentioned that somewhere in the paper that there is an empirical question. It feels that, the way this is currently set up is very much saying, like, it really turns on these very higher order states, and they, in terms of this very abstract judgment about whether things are seen or not seen.
Right.
But in terms of like all the heavy lifting in terms of the content is being done by all the lower order stuff. So, but it feels like, and I think you and Hakwan in your paper, you made this point as well, that it seems like a kind of empirical question where the balance of power lies in terms of what determines the content. It could be that just in both cases, you need higher order states, but it could be that the higher order states are also quite rich in terms of what they can represent. Or it could be that the higher order states are relatively impoverished in terms of their content, and they just index things happening lower down, which is exactly what this model is doing. But that seems like an empirical question, and you could start maybe testing it using brain imaging and finding cases where there have been lesions to visual areas.
I think these are important things that we're going to have to look in. Part of me is, I don't want to get too pessimistic, but I think you wrote a paper about this. Not a paper, but a blog article about this paper recently about the microchip.
Oh God, yeah.
The Donkey Kong.
It's so depressing.
And that's something that does tend to depress me a little bit, is that here's something we understand basically 100%, and then they basically show half of the things we do in neuroscience.
Yeah, well, it's like C. elegans, right? We know that circuitry 100%, and that's a real biological system, and yet it still has like, it's so nonlinear in the way all the bits interact that making predictions is incredibly tough.
Exactly.
I mean, but then the reason I start getting, I often oscillate through depression and optimism. About this issue, I should make clear.
Yeah, exactly.
But like I think the optimism is that it's almost remarkable that cognitive neuroscience has worked at all.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
If that's the case, like. People do experiments all the time using brain imaging, and they get a lot of the time very cool and interpretable results. Right. Now, there's obviously lots of things you need to think about when you do those kind of experiments, and you don't want to fish around just to find things. But it's almost more remarkable that we've got anything rather than nothing. Right. When you think about the kind of problems with interpreting even simple systems.
It just highlights how careful you need to be in drawing inferences about function and lesion studies and stuff, I think.
Yes, yeah, it does. And also maybe it tells you that, maybe we'll never have an explanation at the level of kind of the individual neurons when it comes, or, transistors in that microchip, right? When it comes to kind of more software level functions. But maybe we don't need to. Maybe staying at the relatively core systems level is enough for kind of explaining higher cognition.
I mean, yeah. So this is a debate that's come up in a different context in deep dream and those sorts of things when they're looking at trying to decompose these AI systems and figure out what the levels of representation, what are they actually doing. Sometimes it's opaque, but sometimes they find things that look similar to. Yeah, I guess there was one paper that showed there was things like grid cells, which sort of had manifested. Which I was surprised by, but that was something that Richard Passingham pointed out to me. But so it does seem like maybe there's some hope for us at some point. Some hope for this kind of methodology. But I
think also that part of the optimism I have is that, like, if things are more like a generative model, so the kind of classical microchips that Conrad Cording was looking at in that paper are not generative models, right? Whereas if the brain's a generative model, and if some of the computational models we can start developing are generative models, then maybe things will just magically start to line up.
Magic,
yeah.
Exactly. That's our hope.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you forever, but I want to ask about consciousness in the prefrontal cortex. Because some of your work has been used in this debate, so I want to kind of get it from your perspective directly. There's a tremendous debate. I mean, this is kind of related to a lot of stuff we've been talking about with overflow and higher order theories, and because there's a specific hypothesis, namely that a lot of these things that higher order theorists are interested in may be found in the prefrontal cortex. And in fact, Hawkman has a general argument that maybe the systems underlying metacognition are serving both explicit and also this kind of thing here, that they're shared in a way. So coming with that is this idea that we should look at prefrontal cortex for maybe the part that's important for whether there's consciousness or not. And then one kind of major response to that is that, there's been lots of lesions to the prefrontal cortex, and we don't really find deficits in conscious experience. Mm-hmm. So your work has often been taken to suggest that we do, but you have to look carefully. So I'm wondering how you interpret the results that you've had, or do you think it bears on this debate in the way that some people think it does?
Yeah, so I think so. There's lots of things circling around this debate. So I guess one is the status of lesion studies. The other is the methodology you use. Could all the prefrontal activation be about report and not about experience? So the kind of rise of these no report methods. And I think the other one is it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like maybe just definitions, that maybe, one group are studying what they define as conscious awareness, but actually it's more to do with metacognitive sensitivity, ability to reflect on performance, whereas another group is just looking at, first order discrimination and classifying that as conscious. And so I think those three things often get all mixed up in this debate. I think there's two things, that we often forget. So the first is that the prefrontal cortex is a pretty big brain region, right? Especially in humans, luckily. Yeah. Otherwise,
some of
if
us
it
more
wasn't,
than others, Steve.
well, yeah. Speak for yourself, Richard. Speak for yourself. But I think there's some fantastic work that's being done in terms of both comparative anatomy and studying the functions of the human prefrontal cortex in other areas of cognitive neuroscience, like decision making and so on, that could be quite useful, I think, for us in consciousness science. So, for instance, work from Matthew Rushworth's lab in Oxford has shown that the pattern of connections in the human brain is very similar to the pattern of connections in the monkey brain in terms of prefrontal cortex. But there are, really interestingly, there are kind of these one or two extra regions or extra kind of areas that have these connectional fingerprints that just don't appear in the macaque brain, right? But they're super specific in the sense that, like, they have a particular pattern of connections going to areas of the parietal cortex, going to other areas within the frontal lobe itself. And we're really interested in kind of starting to use some of these sub-regional analyses in our imaging experiments to think about what is the contribution of this relatively fine, this finer scale anatomy to things like metacognition and awareness. So I think often, the debates turn on, you really need to think about the details of how different, the different contribution that different regions of the prefrontal cortex might be making to higher cognition in general, but also to conscious awareness. So I kind of think it's too premature to say, is the prefrontal cortex involved in consciousness? Because in a sense, like, it's a very broad question, and really we would need to be thinking, it'd be a bit like saying, is half the brain involved in consciousness? Well, probably yes, but we need to nail down the question a little bit more clearly. But I think that that perspective then also sheds new light on debates surrounding lesion studies. So I know, aware of these articles, debating between Melanie Bowley and her colleagues and Hakwan Lau and that side of things. And I think, it's difficult because lesion studies are messy, and, when you're doing human lesion studies, you're kind of dealing with often quite diffuse injuries and you don't really know what connections have been severed or not, unless you've got access to kind of like high resolution diffusion weighted imaging where you can actually see white matter tracks and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's just a cautionary note that, like, we're dealing with when we talk about prefrontal cortex, we're dealing with a system with many different subregions, with many different computational functions, and its interconnectivity is really complicated. And so when you've just got single lesions, it's really hard to make a prediction for what you're going to see. And then also you've got the issue of compensation and so on, and things like that. So I think with all those caveats in mind, there probably are, we've seen in our lesion studies where when we do select patients, so this was a study that I did with when I was in New York, actually, with NYU. So when we selected patients who had tumor resections in the anterior prefrontal cortex, so the criteria was that the surgery had to have affected the Brodmann area 10 from like a human brain atlas, but it could have been that the surgery also affected loads of other regions. It was just like that was the criteria for selection. When we selected people with those kind of lesions, and then we invited them to participate in these perceptual tasks, then we saw a pretty massive drop in metacognitive sensitivity compared to a control group who had lesions elsewhere in the brain, right? So,
right.
I mean, yeah, it's not, if you were to meet obviously me and my RA were talking to these, to people who are coming in for the tests, and it was really hard to tell, who was in which group. It wasn't as if you're dealing with someone who's unconscious and sitting there in the chair and you're just like pressing buttons, right? It's not like that at all. It's a super subtle change, but you can pick it up using these measures of metacognition. So but then there's also been, there's a recent paper from a group in France who have found a null result with lesions to the anterior prefrontal cortex and metacognition, and that's now published. So,
Interesting.
I think, lesion studies are messy. Prefrontal cortex is a poorly understood and differentiated system, and if the guys with Donkey Kong can't work it out with a microchip, then I mean, I don't think we should be having too strong a debate about, Anyway.
Yes, the argument from Donkey Kong with on a microchip. Exactly. By the way, yes.
But also,
4-year-old is now in love with Donkey Kong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Still, it lives to this day.
Yeah.
Anyway, what were you going to say?
No, so it's just reminding me of one thing, which is I think I mentioned this in my blog post about the Donkey Kong paper, is that again, once we start taking those details into account, I think there is also reason for cautious optimism, because there's a really there's a beautiful series of studies, a long-running program of work by Kathy Price, who runs a group in our center. She's our center director studying language function, right? And there's been, and this is not something I know much about, but as far as I know, there's been all these debates about whether different regions in the left hemisphere contribute to language, based on often patterns of brain damage, because people have strokes, they can't speak, but another person might have a stroke very close to that, and somehow they're able to recover language. And what she's shown is that you can get really good predictive power in terms of predicting whether someone's going to recover their language or not following a stroke, but only if you take into account the extent to which the lesion has damaged connections between regions, not just individual regions, right? And these models are now so good that they've built a kind of a big machine learning model, and they're now being used in the UK National Health Service to actually, you get a kind of personalized prediction. If you had a stroke, they can now say, well, you've got an 80% chance of regaining language function, so it makes sense for you to go along to all your appointments and try and have therapy. Wow. So it's a really cool kind of practical result, but it only was obtained by recognizing that you can't just focus on kind of a brain damage here or brain damage here. You have to understand the connections between all the regions and how they're sharing information.
Yeah, it's kind of a simple point that the brain is massively interconnected, but if people get corralled, it's so easy to get corralled into thinking about like this area, and that's just
absolutely
the wrong way of thinking about the brain. It has to be.
Yeah, but I mean, it is like, I think it's something that affects everybody in the field. I think it requires a kind of concerted effort to often get out of that way of thinking, because we're so used to kind of thinking about brain imaging as areas as lighting up, and
right. The subtractive method is so far in the background now of our just way of doing things that it's not questioned anymore, or not questioned, but it's just we don't often remind ourselves of actually what it is that it signifies.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the objections that, just to bring us back to the pattern of lesion stuff, and with all the caveats and everything accepted and well noted. So one of the kind of objections that you get to the Chiropractic theory is that we should expect some visual deficits when you have large enough damage to the prefrontal area, and not just subtle ones. So one of the criticisms, this is Benji Kozik has made this point, but a couple other, Ned makes this point as well, I think, in a couple places. But the idea is that the effects that you find are kind of subtle effects, and you said so yourself, and I think it's undeniable that you have to really look for them, and they're subtle effects in their judgments about how well they're doing. They're either overconfident or underconfident. that if this is really the area that's important for consciousness, then losing it, we would expect something more like more dramatic, like blind sight, where they just where part of it's gone or something like that.
Yeah.
And we don't seem to find anything like that. So that doesn't bother you about higher order theories, or how do you respond to that kind of objection?
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't really thought this through enough, but I guess, I mean, the blindsight case is interesting because, in a sense, the strong, the strong dissociation there is that, in a sense, it's the reverse dissociation where you don't have kind of sufficient input potentially to these higher order. If you take a higher order view of blindsight, then you can think of the reason that might have occurred is based on some kind of like process that sets the criterion for whether you consider something as seen or not seen, and that could be very higher order along the lines of Hack-Van-Lau's models. But in a sense, the everything else about the blindsight subject remains intact in terms of his ability to abstract away from experience to comment on what it is like to not have that experience, right? So it's kind of like, in a sense, it's not as if he's unconscious, right? That higher order state space is there. And the most salient aspect of blindsight is that he says, patient GY says to you that he has no experience. It kind of comes back to this idea of like absence being really important when we think about these higher order states. So like, but in the case of the kind of prefrontal lesions, then in a way, it would be surprising if the deficit would be so salient to the subject who has the deficit, right? Because
the deficit
yeah, exactly. So you might well be able to do lots of, I don't know. I think this is, again, it's an open question, and maybe it comes back to that point we were debating earlier about the kind of relative division of labor between more abstract states and more first order like states in terms of the contents of experience. But it seems to me like that if you did have lesions to higher order states, it'd be hard to find out because I wouldn't be able to tell you about it.
Exactly. Wouldn't be able to report it.
Yeah, exactly. I'd still maybe be able to do lots of different other tasks because many other systems remain intact. But it'd be pretty hard to. But then it's a really slippery slope because then what are you saying then? Are you saying like that person's not conscious for a variety of important purposes? It's really tough to work out. But in a way, it's kind of like reminiscent of this. There was this early set of studies by a colleague of mine at UCL, Paul Burgess, on the role of the anterior prefrontal cortex in higher cognition. And he recognized in the 1990s that like it seemed that people with lesions to this region just didn't have any problem. They could pass all these cognitive tests, like they were fine on the card sorting test and on IQ tests and all this kind of thing. And so it turned out that, to find out why, to kind of find a deficit following those lesions, you had to devise some really subtle tests, which turned out to involve, very abstract monitoring of task switching and attention. So the idea was that there's like a really abstract level of processing that's just not really tapped into by standard cognitive tests. So from the outside, they look absolutely fine. But it's a really intriguing question. Like if you have these really high level abstract states that are impaired, you might seem fine, but does that have consequences for your conscious experience?
Right.
It would seem reasonable to me that it does have big consequences for your conscious experience, but it'd be hard for you to tell other people about it.
Right. And so that, it sort of seems like it's starting to push on the whole awareness reports as a kind of source for knowledge about consciousness, because you're running up to the limits of that here, where like one of the most important things that we would want to know about is whether there is or isn't conscious experience in this case. And it seems like
Well, yeah, but
can't really-
maybe we're hitting the limits of kind of narrative discussions about my experience, like the kind of blindside case. It's like, no, it really does seem, and there's obviously been lots of interest in interviewing people with blindside about what does it feel like to have blindside. But I think, and maybe that is the kind of very abstract level that would be impaired if you had problems with forming abstract state spaces about your perceptual experience, right? But I still think, like, if we maybe reduce it down to kind of more task-based measures, like just saying yes or no on a did I see something or not on a psychophysics test, then my hope is, and we just need to do the empirical work here, is that there will be features of those data that will tell us that higher order state is knocked out.
Right.
So it's not that, like, the reports are critical, but it's just that the kind of more kind of narrative level might not be very helpful.
Right. No, yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess what I was saying was that if what you're trying to do is test empirically the claim that consciousness depends on the prefrontal cortex, or isn't that the prefrontal cortex is involved in it in an important way or something like that, then it doesn't look like you're going to be able to use reports in this paradigm where you're looking for its absence. But normally we do use that when people say, I don't see it. That's, good evidence that they didn't see it and blah, blah, blah. And yet, I mean, yeah, so I think
I guess what I'm saying is, so take our experiment on the frontopolar lesion patients. We could have asked in detail, after the experiment, did you notice anything strange there? Like, and everyone might have said the same thing. We didn't do that, but everyone might have said the same thing. But because we had these trial by trial ratings, we could then fit our models and find a pretty drastic drop in metacognitive sensitivity. So I guess that's what I'm getting at, that, like, it might not seem, just interacting with each other, that there's major differences, but when we actually quantify things like criterion, sensitivity, metacognitive awareness, all those kind of things, then you might see fairly big differences, but that's not typically done.
Right. Yeah. So there's an empirically answerable question here, but the question is whether that's the same as the question about consciousness.
Yeah.
So is their conscious experience impaired in the way that you would predict, given that, important areas are not working, generating the kind of representations, or is it just, they have the normal conscious experience and just they're not very good at paying attention to it or judge or monitoring it?
Yeah.
And so how could you test that if what we're using we'll
take the example of, like, neglect, right? So
yeah, neglect is another case. Yeah,
it's a really interesting case, because you ask the neglect person, is there anything wrong? And they're like, no, it's cool.
Exactly.
Right? Like, I can see the whole visual field, but then you get them to draw a clock face, it's half the clock. So that's, then you can make a really strong inference that they're, experiencing they don't have experience about half the visual field, but as we know, there's been all these debates about maybe kind of first order processing of that is intact. And so I agree with you. There comes a point at which you've got to kind of put your hands up and say, well, if you want to claim that in neglect, first order phenomenology is intact of the neglected hemifield, then fine. I can't really get much further on that, but, like, you can say there's a difference between someone claiming that everything is okay, and when you actually probe their conscious experience using a series of finer grained measures, like tasks, like tests and so on, then it looks odd.
I completely agree with everything you're saying. It's just that, and I don't want to belabor this, but maybe I already am, so who knows? But it just seems like if there's ever going to be any kind of progress as a field, then we're going to have to kind of and with this, something we were talking about earlier, but we're going to have to, at some point as a field, decide what counts as an indication when there is or isn't consciousness in a subject that we're looking at. And there's a lot of debate about whether it should be subjective reports or some objective measures. And some people are saying, in binocular rivalry, you can look at eye pupil dilation, and that's an indication. And then other people say, no, you can have that's unconsciously. And so no one knows what counts as evidence for or against a theory of consciousness at this point, because no one agrees what counts as an indicator that there is consciousness around. And it just seems, and so one side saying, look, you hired people, if you're saying this, and so if that part of the brain is missing, we should expect large deficits. And we say, no, you're thinking in terms of a first order theory, and we'd only expect that if there was a tight correlation between the conscious experience and the first order states driving the behavior. And then, well, all right, so what do you do after that? I mean, it just starts to seem like, until all sides can kind of agree about what we're measuring and when it's there, it's going to be a state of chaos, and the Wild West is going to continue to ensue.
No, and I think that those are all reasonable critiques against the current state of the field. But I think in a sense we've come a long way as well. If you think that we now do have things like the development of solid tools for quantifying, separating out sensitivity from where you set your criterion using signal detection theory and things like quantifying metacognitive sensitivity. In a sense, it'd be a bit like the field of memory research saying, well, we have all these forgetting curves and stuff, but still we want to know what's happening on that particular trial, right? It feels like consciousness research is not happy with having metrics that maybe are derived from fitting models and things. We always still want to somehow go back to the experience on kind of individual trials. And I think that will, or when we question people about individual instances of their experience, and I think that we might have to remain unsatisfied about that. We might, as a field, end up divorcing from the folk psychology on that point.
That's very.
And I think maybe the pressure is just much stronger in the field of consciousness, because it feels like, well, no, we want to get to the what this is like on this one particular trial.
I mean, you think we've already done that, with attention and memory, divorce ourselves from the folk psychology? I mean, or
yes, I think we have, to a large extent. I think often when you go to big neuroscience conferences and you sit in talks and people talk about mechanisms for memory and attention, they might have an opening slide where they say, "We all know what attention is like," and let's quote William James. Yeah. But once they go beyond that, they're off, right? And they're dealing with measures and mechanism,
right?
And I think maybe there's just it feels like consciousness tugging at the reins of being able to do that, but maybe haven't quite got there.
Right. That's a really interesting. That's an interesting point. Okay. So I want. There's a million things I want to, but I want to try to stay focused. I mean, I'm having bad trouble doing that, but I wanted to ask about this.
No, it's good.
Non-biological.
I'm just realizing that my headphones are running out of battery, but this is not a signal that we need to finish. I just need to unbluetooth myself. Hang on.
Okay.
Let me just see if that works.
You're non-cycle now.
Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, nice.
I wanted to ask about consciousness in non-biological systems, which I think is what Ned was pressing you about, that you alluded to earlier. So do you think that a sophisticated enough implementation of your model is going to be conscious?
Yeah, short answer, yes. But with a major caveat that, so it was interesting. So maybe I just say what Ned was asking me. So I gave a talk on this higher order state space model at ASSC, and at the end of the talk, Ned Block said, you haven't said anything about why this model, whether this model would just be conscious in the first place. Like, what is it about the model that makes it conscious? And if you're not going to say anything about that, then we should just assume that the kind of little MATLAB simulation you have in your computer is conscious. And I said, well, no, absolutely, that's not the case. But then his response was, well, it seems just really easy to make it conscious because this awareness state is so simple. Right. So I think that is a really important point, that it seems that if you have a very kind of abstract state, that because it is so abstract, and in the model that I wrote down in the paper, it's just binary. It's just kind of, is stuff there or not, right? So if you just think about that state itself, then yes, it's super simple. But the fact that to get that, to do inference at that level in a very asymmetric network is actually really hard. So one lesson we've learned from these kind of probabilistic generative model is that doing inference, to kind of asking what each level in the network is telling you, is really hard when the state space is big, which is presumably the case for regular perception, right? So the model I have in the paper just has the ability to represent things that are tilted left or right. It doesn't have the ability to represent all the possible things we could see. So as soon as you have a really big state space, you can't do exact inference anymore, because doing that means you have to kind of do what's called marginalize over all possible values of all the states you could have seen to do inference at that higher order level. So an alternative is doing something approximation to Bayesian inference. And so there's various proposals about this, and it's a fast moving field, but two of the dominant proposals are some kind of form of sampling, like Markov chain Monte Carlo, where you draw samples from the distributions, and that once you draw enough samples, then you kind of get inference for free falling out of that sampling algorithm. Another way of doing it is something called variational Bayes, where you make assumptions, simplifying assumptions about how the variables interact. So there's lots of people working on this, but I don't have a proof of this because I haven't explored more complicated versions of this particular network. But I would bet that even with approximate inference, the computations required for doing inference at this would be super heavy, and it would be computationally costly to kind of evolve this higher order state. So I think that we're not going to be able to write down or simulate a model with these kind of realistic perceptual spaces that does this kind of higher order inference anytime soon. And even if we could, it would be super computationally costly. So we would kind of need a good reason for doing it. And so that's also where I think an interesting evolutionary story might come into play.
Right, but why does any of that stuff matter to answering Ned's question, I wonder?
Well, it matters a lot to answering the second point, which is the misperception that this is somehow easy to do just because it's so simple. Right.
But why isn't the answer that you're giving that it's hard to do in an asymmetric state space?
Yeah.
But that's not what's important to the model. At the top is just these two states. That's what's important. How they're arrived at is what's interesting and new in your model. But just getting to the top abstract state doesn't require having all that asymmetry in place.
Well, it does, because it abstracts away from the lower level states, right? So,
but if you just have a really simple system,
it doesn't make sense to reverse so the important aspect is that it's a factorized space. So it has the ability to report the presence or absence of anything. Rather than just having you could imagine building a simple network that kind of can do presence of red things, absence of red things, presence of blue things, absence of blue things, right? But it can't abstract a general quantity, general property, which is presence or things being there, right? So it does need this, at least, there's various ways of setting it up, but it does at least need this ability to factorize the space.
But why? So in the simple system that you mentioned, with it's just presence of red, absence of red.
Yeah.
How couldn't you set the system up so that when it detects that, then there's a monitoring of that, and then if it detects presence of red, it's connected to the switch that says awareness of red or something, and if it says non-presence of red is connected to the switch that says awareness of absence of red. So you get the same.
I mean, that's basically the way that the current model is set up, which is incredibly simple. So I think what you need, basically my kind of richer answer to Ned's question is that in order to characterize human awareness reports, you need a rich perceptual state space, and then you need the ability to factorize out a representation of presence and absence from that rich state space.
Right.
Now, we can then debate about, like, when you make the state space simpler and simpler and simpler, like, is there a point at which it doesn't qualify anymore for these kind of awareness reports? And I kind of dodge that question.
But I think that's what, I mean, that's the way I interpret it, is that's the question. Is like, so what about it is making this an awareness report?
Right. I think the question had two parts. One is just a straightforward question about computational cost.
Right.
And the other thing is, there's the bigger question about, like, what makes it aware. And I will put my hands up that I dodged the question at ASSC, and I'm going to dodge it again now. Because, like, I think that is the goal of the model is to characterize human awareness reports. And, now we have a model in place that can do that, I think. And what we're planning to do, over the next year or two, is to try and fit this model to data. And that, so that's really the goal. The questions about how rich does the state space need to be, and how does it need to be organized to actually connect to a kind of stronger version of the model, which is saying this is really a true model of awareness, then I wouldn't have a good answer for that at the moment.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I mean, because generally the higher order type answer to those sorts of questions is that, consciousness is associated with a kind of awareness of your own mental functioning. And this is how that gets implemented.
Right.
But I noticed that noticeably you were not saying any of that sort of stuff in your response to that.
Well, I think it's, no, that's true. And I think that, like, one thing I've been thinking about more recently, in a relatively half-baked way, is, if it is computationally costly, which presumably it is if it is set up in this way, then it must have some kind of function.
Yeah, what's the point of it?
What's the point? And I think, and I've been quite influenced by Michael Graziano's thinking on this.
The attention schema.
Yeah. So I think, the higher order state space idea and the attention schema idea share a lot in common. They're both ideas that is kind of, you need a model of the perceptual system.
Right.
But they differ in that for Graziano, the model is of attention, whereas here I would view attention as kind of providing a supporting role. It provides a useful input for this higher order state space, but it's not, what's doing the heavy lifting.
Right. But I think what you like too is, like, kind of the explanation of what Chalmers calls the meta problem. So why do we think consciousness is hard? Well, because there's a model that's kind of describing what's going on in a way that's inconsistent with what we think is really in there. So
Right. Exactly. So no, I am definitely attracted to those kind of ways of thinking about it. And I think that, one interesting proposal that Graziano makes is that in some way there's a tight connection between conscious awareness of ourselves and social cognition.
Right.
And I think that, the approach that we're working on could have a similar flavor, although we haven't yet explored that. So one interesting function could be to kind of keep track of perceptual access in general. So do I have access to things in my environment perceptually? Do you? And maybe, and there's all those cool experiments on chimpanzees where they kind of know that the trainer can see the food and not, and all that kind of stuff. So I think, it's clearly not the same thing, because it's not as if suddenly I have first person access to what you're saying.
Right.
But the computations that are involved may be quite similar. It requires me to have an abstract state which tells me something about whether you can see something or not.
Right.
That has nothing to do with the content of what you're saying. It's just that, tag, which tells me, do I need to be worried about the fact Richard can see the food that I can see?
Right. You don't. You can have it.
So that to me seems, to be, and then, there's a whole interesting line of thought you can take on experiments you could do to try and test that by, integrating some ideas from tests of theory of mind and social cognition and things. But it feels like that to me could be a really interesting thing to pursue.
I mean, I wish that Graziani himself was more open to this, but clearly that type of view is a kind of higher order view.
Yes.
There's a description of what attention is doing at a higher level. That's what consciousness is. He doesn't want it to be like David Rosenthal's version of the theory, so he goes around saying it's not. But that's partially why we wrote the paper with Haquan and Joe Ledoux, which is coming out hopefully someday, was just so people sort of know, like, yeah, that's a version of higher order theory. You're saying the same stuff, just implementing it in a different way.
Which I found that a really useful paper, by the way. So
oh, thank you.
Thanks for doing that. But
yeah, thanks. it was a lot of fun, but also a lot of work. So I guess what I'm trying to get. So let me try to back up and see if I understand what you're saying. Mm-hmm. So in answer to this question, why isn't the simulation on your laptop conscious? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Your response is, what? That it's not complicated enough. There's not enough inference going on there. The state space is not. I mean, so I'm just not exactly sure what your response was. I mean, because what I hear you saying is, yeah, it's not like human experience. We have this very complicated asymmetric state space. This one's less complicated. But that doesn't seem to really address the question about whether it is conscious. I mean, in the way that you might say that the logic gates of the IIT, they bite the bullet on that one. Say, yeah, it's conscious. But you're not biting any bullets here. So I'm wondering why. I mean, maybe I missed it and I'm just being dense, but I didn't really say what. I know you want to dodge it, but I'm wondering if this.
This is what I was about to say again. I was like, I'm dodging it. So I think there's a few answers. I think basically I want to say that it's just too early in the current characterization. This simulation is not conscious because the simulation is wrong. It's not, doesn't have all the bits that we need in there to actually do this higher order inference. And there are various things that I mentioned in passing in the paper that I think are going to be critical. So the thought experiment on the closing the eyes, that is aimed at saying we need more than just kind of bottom up input to do the inference. We need a way of the system also knowing something about the state of attention. So this can be modeled as the precision of the input. And at the moment that in the model is just kind of floating there without any, it's not connected up to anything. So Carl Friston has these very powerful proposals about how we not only model content, but we also model precision, and that is really what attention is. It's like, do I expect good signal over there? And if I do, then I end up paying attention to it. Right. So all these things, like how it connects to action and expectations about attention and precision. And then if you've got all those things in and you've got a very rich state space and you're doing this marginalization and creating this abstract property, then yeah, okay, fine. But like, if you could do all that,
then you're fine.
With like a robot that's pretty much like the human brain. So, I mean, yeah.
And so, I mean, there's nothing in principle that you would object to an AI being able to do that.
No, I think it would have to be quite, and I think it couldn't be a kind of brain in the vat AI. It would need to be quite active, and it would need to be doing kind of this, active search in the world, to have something approaching human consciousness.
I mean, I always wonder about that brain in the vat stuff because, not to get too distracted, but in one sense, I understand what you're talking about. That if the brain is kind of fundamentally passive and just fed a projector show, but if it's in a virtual environment and a virtual body, then it should be the same, right?
Yeah, by brain in the vat, I didn't necessarily mean something fundamental about you could simulate all those things like it's in the Matrix. That's fine by me.
Yeah.
But it's more about it needs to be able to act in its world.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. It can't be passively fed a movie of something.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Because I mean, I always secretly hold out hope that that's going to be wrong and that AIs won't be conscious. But you know, so I'm kind of persuaded by some of Ned's intuition arguing in this area, but I'm not extremely I'm not as confident as I used to be, but still have some hope that there's something distinctly biological, which is the
I see.
Yeah,
well, I think maybe rich generative models could, you know, go well. I mean, we know that we can implement rich generative models in software as well,
right?
But I think, you know, if you want to contrast it with current state of the art in AI, I mean, a lot of the successes in machine learning are fundamentally feed forward neural nets doing like massive backprop and maybe coupled to some value learning system, right? Like reinforcement learning. You know, that is very distinct to the kind of generative model idea. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I know it's a different computational architecture, definitely, for sure. Right. I haven't really had a chance to ask you about any of the practical results that your lab has uncovered, which is so interesting. But I mean, I wonder, so how important, just as a general way of swathing over all that stuff, how important do you think metacognition is for normal functioning in society? Given that you find such a variance in performance, is this a problem, isn't it? I mean,
well, so I mean, I think as a general concept, I think it is important, and I think there have been interesting efforts to kind of put metacognition into things like education, that
you mean mindfulness and stuff like that.
Not so much mindfulness, more like actual using the word metacognition and saying, like, you know, encouraging kids to check their thinking on a particular topic and kind of, you know, filling in little questionnaires saying, what do I know? What do I don't know? What don't I know? And so on. So I think those are interesting efforts, but I think part of the problem is that, you know, the kind of the more quantitative approaches that have been developed for studying metacognition in the lab haven't yet been translated into these more applied contexts. So we don't really know whether they work at all in terms of like improving people's metacognition and so on. But that is something we're trying to work on as well.
Right.
Completely different line of work on metacognitive training, the extent to which this training is domain general. So if I train your metacognition on one task, do you see generalized benefits? And we have some encouraging results on that. So I think that, you know, to the extent to which it is a relatively domain general thing, I think there are exciting opportunities to potentially think, well, if I could boost your awareness of performance more generally, maybe that would have benefits in different areas of life. But
right. There's some real suggestive results, like this political radicalness result, which got a lot of attention from your lab. That people on both sides tend to have impaired or ability to be sensitive to how well they're doing.
Exactly. So, you know, in a sense, like one hypothesis we're pursuing is, could boosting domain general metacognition help you in being more reflective in other aspects of daily life, like decision making, like learning, and so on. And so, I think we're just starting that line of work. But I'm pretty optimistic that could be the case because, you know, in a sense, like we've been quite, you know, there's been a focus on improving just general ability. You know, there's this, all the brain training stuff about, like, boost your IQ, and education is all about like academic success and knowing all the capitals of the world and all that kind of thing, right? So I feel like there's maybe a opportunity to complement that. I'm not saying, well, that's not important, but to complement it with systematic exploration of whether training up self-awareness in a similar way as formal education trains up intelligence would also be helpful.
Exactly. No, I think that's really important, especially when you start thinking about, you know, the criminal justice system. And I mean, I think it's only a matter of time till we have the metacognition defense in the courtroom somewhere. It's like,
Yeah.
I couldn't tell I was doing something bad metacognition. I didn't know.
Well, I mean, definitely there's interesting stuff on trying to use metacognition tests to qualify an eyewitness statement, because that is a whole field of research on eyewitness confidence. And it's amazing actually, like when you think about like the threshold for kind of new evidence being introduced, like new techniques, like DNA gets into courtrooms because it's so reliable, right? And yet we're still with eyewitness confidence, which is just like completely unreliable.
Exactly. It's like if you fail change blindness tests, then you should not be an eyewitness.
Well, I mean, there's probably an argument to be said for that. I mean, not that I want to create like a kind of two-tier society stuff. I'd be very happy if someone told me, hang on, Steve, we've tested your memory metacognition for this particular, set of faces, and you're terrible. So we'd rather not you not give this confident statement in court. I'd be like, yeah, fair enough. To be honest, like you've told me that I'm not very good at evaluating confidence in my memory, so I shouldn't be an eyewitness. So, like, yeah, I don't see a problem with that. Like, I think there's a resistance to that kind of classification because it sounds like we're kind of saying, well, let's divide people into the good ones and the bad ones. But
it's just we're taking seriously the idea that this is an ability, and just like any other ability, there's variance in how good you can do it. So we can't just treat everyone the same in this respect.
Yeah.
But the criminal justice system does. It just assumes eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, I need to look into this again. I know there were a couple of papers on trying. I think there was a couple of jurisdictions. New Jersey apparently is very good on integrating the latest science on eyewitness memory. But that was the last stuff I read about it. It's been a while.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've kept you already for very, very much time. So I wonder is there anything that hasn't come up that you were hoping would come up, or anything we haven't talked about yet that you wanted to bring up?
Or is there anything that has come up that I was hoping wouldn't come up?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
No, I think there's it's been really fun.
It's been great talking with you. I think you're doing great work. I mean, it's not only are you doing great empirical work, but it's just always really nice to have someone who cares as much about doing good science, having good models, but also thinking hard about the kind of big theoretical questions that some people call philosophical, but really are just big theoretical questions. So it's nice. It's rare that you find someone who really cares about all of those things. I think you really do, though. So I think it's good that there are people like you out there.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind. And and thanks for setting this up. And it was really fun. And All
right. Well, stay on board. I'll say bye after we hang out.
Okay, cool. All right.
Really appreciate it.